And thank you again for this wonderful opportunity to be able to speak to you, to be in your homes, and for you to be in mine. The world has gotten so small, and that's a wonderful thing that we can all reach through time and space to each other and be able to be together on this beautiful Sabbath morning. I want us to turn now our Bibles because we're going to talk about faith. And let's turn to Hebrews chapter 11. And this is a chapter, these verses have been often spoken about, but it's very vital that we understand the immensity of this message and the mystery of it as well. And if we start at the very first chapter, let's start verses 1 through 3, and then we're going to go to verse 6. And it says here, now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. For by it the elders obtained a good report. Through faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that things which are now seen were not made of things which do appear. It seems like a play at words. Things which are seen were not made by things which do appear. The spiritual, the power of God, is what made everything that we now enjoy. And then it goes down on verse 6, if you join me there. It says, but without faith, it is impossible to please him. For he that cometh to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. And now in the second part of my story, I'm going to talk to you about faith. Because it took a great deal of faith to make many of the moves that occurred next, not only in my life, but in the life of a lot of people. In the next hour, 45 minutes to an hour, I'm going to take you through an incredible trip, and forgive me for hurrying along, but it usually takes me 6 hours to give this second half of the story, which is usually fragmented into several presentations. But when I was born in 1981, we were living in what is known in Cuba as La Plaza de la Revolución, which is translated into Revolution Plaza. There's where all the ministries are. And there are several buildings that belong to the government. And in those buildings live ministers, colonels, dignitaries that belong to the government. And we lived in Minfar 3, which is a building that belonged to the Ministry of the Interior and of the Armed Forces. And my family lived there because my father worked in the ministry across the square. By that time, my dad was serving as ambassador of Cuba. And I was born into a world full of secrets and into a bubble world in many ways. My mother was not allowed to talk about her family or about her background, so I ignored it completely. The world of the people that belong to that group of the government is very structured. And at the time, it was in many ways separated from the general population, which was very interesting because for a revolution that wanted to destroy classes, they immediately created their own. And so that military elite, many of them moved into the mansions of the wealthy that have been despoiled of their goods and of their properties. And this military class and governmental class became the next elite, the next bourgeoisie, the next aristocrats, and lived far more separated in many ways from the population than the wealthy classes had lived before the revolution. So if you were a child like me, if you went to the beach, you went to a special part of the beach that was reserved for the military only, that had its own clubhouse. If you went to a school, you went to a special school there in Revolution Plaza that was reserved for the children of those dignitaries, of those officers, etc. And this was a privileged path to take you through college so that you in time would fill the shoes of leadership that would be eventually left open by your parents. And so that class of those children, there was a lot of investment to them by the government. And so they would be sent abroad to go to college in Russia and Moscow, etc., to prepare this next generation of communist leadership. So as a child, I ignored completely who my mother was. But there was certain things that began to give parts of this hidden puzzle away. My mother, by that time, was an administrator of commerce. Give me a moment here. Sorry, my screen blacked out for a second. Was an administrator of commerce. And she was working for the government, like most Cubans were. And it seemed like my parents had everything that model Cubans should have. They had a nice apartment and a government building, wonderful careers, etc. And we looked very much like the model family. But there was an incredible sadness in my mother. She was very aloof, cold, distant, unapproachable in many ways. And even as a child, I wondered why that was. And one night, I got up from bed, and my father was in Europe working as an ambassador. And I heard my mother singing. She had cleaned out one of the reception rooms in the apartment, and she was singing. She was sitting in a rocking chair, and she was singing a very sad tune. My voice is a bit raspy because I've been talking since very early this morning. But the song would go, alzaré mis ojos a los montes, de donde vendrá mi socorro viene de Jehová, que hizo los cielos y la tierra. And unbeknownst to me, these were the words of Psalms 121. I will lift up my eyes unto the hills, from where cometh my help? My help cometh from the Lord, who made the heavens and the earth. And she would start sobbing as she sang. Her sobs would drown out her song. And I had never heard of this Jehovah that had made the heavens and the earth. So I always wondered what was so deeply meaningful about those words that would drive my mother, who was such a aloof person to tears and to this very heartfelt sobbing. And so we continued on our lives as normal as always. And one day, my parents decided that they were going to move to a neighborhood outside of Havana called Fontanar. And the reason why this happened was because my mother began to develop a rejection of the entire world that surrounded her. And it began because of a young man whose name was also Alexis. This Alexis was the son of the secretary of Raúl Castro, who after the death of Fidel became the next dictator of Cuba. The son of that secretary was sent to study in Kamachka, which is a very distant province of Russia that has a border with China. And he made a terrible faux pas while there. He said in the open forum of the university that Cuba should have free, democratic, multi-party elections, presidential elections. And that was enough for him to be sent immediately from Kamachka to Cuba to a re-education camp. He was kept in that re-education camp for many months before his parents were allowed to visit him. My mother accompanied his mother to go visit Alexis. Now, my mother had seen Alexis born and grow up into a young man. And when I was born and my parents named me Alexis, he thought that I had been named because of him. So as a baby, he would always take me around. I was his pet because he thought that I was his namesake. So there was a very strong bond within the families of friendship and with him in particular. And so when my mother went to visit Alexis with Alexis's mother, Alexis, who was 19 years old at the time, could not recognize his mother. He had been subjected to such an extended period of electroshock torture that it had erased entirely his memory, to the point that he could not recognize his parents. When my mother saw that, it affected her so deeply that she began to reject everybody in the building. And she began to do something that's extremely, and was even more so at the time in Cuba, extremely dangerous. She began to express her opinions without any filter on a lot of taboo subjects within Cuba. And this created a big problem. So my mother needed to leave that building at all costs. But the communist government would not approve for my parents to move from Revolution Plaza to Fontanar unless there was a medical condition for that to be allowed. So my mother went to see one of her best friends who had become a very eminent psychiatrist in Cuba. And he began to talk to my mother. He wrote a letter to the General Bureau of the Communist Party that my mother was suffering from a syndrome called environmental rejection. And because of that syndrome, she needed to be removed from that atmosphere as soon as possible, or a psychotic breakdown was going to occur. So with that excuse, we moved to Fontanar. And while once we moved to Fontanar, this happened right at the right before the fall of 1989, which is a pivotal moment in human history of recent times. One night, my parents, who had season tickets to the ballet, took me to the Lorca Theater to see the Bolshoi ballet, which was at the time at least the best ballet company in the world. And they were putting up Swan Lake. And I will never forget for all my life that during the intermission, it was October, and during the intermission, my father's aide-de-camp came behind my father's seat and whispered something in his ear. And what he whispered in his ear was, "Sir, the Berlin Wall has fallen." And as this happens, simultaneously, all the different attendants to the other communist leaders that were there at the theater began to approach them to tell them that at that very moment, the Berlin Wall was fallen. And my father stood up and had a massive heart attack right there in the theater, because he understood what that meant. He knew that all of Cuba's commercial contracts were exclusively with the Soviet Union and with all the Soviet Union estates. And if the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union would fragment, Cuba would lose all of its economic partnerships, and it would plunge Cuba into an economic depression and push it to the brink of a revolt or insurrection that could topple the government and violence, and we could be very much involved as a result of that. They had to take my father to the hospital where he was gravely ill for several weeks, and then he recovered. And as soon as he recovered, the communist government sent him to Romania, because he had been serving there as ambassador to try to save the contracts that Cuba had with the Romanian government. While my father was in Romania, he witnessed with his own two eyes as they dragged out Ceausescu and his wife and executed them in front of the enraged population of Romania that had been subjected to every possible abuse under the communist dictatorship in that country. And then he returned to Cuba, knowing that it was very likely that those winds of change could come and sweep Cuba away just as well. And so when all of this is occurring, God takes opportunity of all this upheaval that's going on in the world to come knocking in our door. And the way that this happened was a very incredible thing that occurred. Unbeknownst to me, there was a lady, and this lady had been stalking me since I was born. It was a special lady. Her name is Betsaida Giraldo, and she was the Bible worker of the Marianao Church in Havana, Cuba. And Betsaida Giraldo, I could sit here and talk about her for hours. But to give you a snippet of who she is one of the few Adventist Bible workers that stayed true to the Lord throughout the worst period of persecution. And she devoted herself to go to the concentration camps, to go to the jails, to visit all those that were that have been detained and were in those long sentences. She would go door to door to invite people to go to church at great personal risk, because all this was illegal, and you could be sent off to the Yuma concentration camps yourself. And she continued to have the Bible studies in secret in her church. All throughout those decades, she worked with the church so that she could continue to reach people. But she had an interesting background with my mother's family in particular. One of my mother's aunts had sent her to the College of the Antilles and had paid for her education there to become a Bible worker. And when that aunt had left Cuba, she left a commission for Betsaida Fuentes. And she said, Betsaida, we have a black sheep in the family that has left the church. And her name is Xiomara. And I want you every year, no matter what, I want you to visit her. And I want you to remind Xiomara who is the God of her fathers. So no matter what's going on, Betsaida, we leave you in charge of that. So that every year you visit Xiomara. And Betsaida did that for decades. Every year, no matter where my mother was, she would find her. And she would go and visit her and remind her what the God of her fathers had done for her family and for her life, and that he was still extending out his hands. He was knocking her heart. She just needed to extend her hands in faith, and he would make miracles to bring her back into the fold. So when I was born, Betsaida went in secret to see my mother. She said to my mother, you know, you have a handsome and healthy child. You must come to church to thank the Lord that he has blessed you in this manner. And my mother would say, well, Betsaida, you know, I can never go to church because I will be reported. I will be, the government will come and make trouble. And Betsaida said, well, if you cannot come to the church, give an offering of the church for in gratitude of this blessing. And come near to the door and stand near to the window so you can hear the hymns being sung. And that you can hear, even in the distance, the word of God being spoken. Don't come into the church, but come near the window. Come near the door. And so this was, of course, an impossible request. But Betsaida would make it. And as I was growing up, she would come near the house and ask my mother through a messenger to put me in the window so that she could see me, or put me in the balcony so that she could see me. And Betsaida, in the distance, she would pray over me. And so every year, Betsaida would go and visit my mother. And this woman had seen me all the years of my life, and I had never been aware of her existence. And when we moved into Fontanar, the level of security that we had been under was relaxed a bit. To give you an idea of the scrutiny that the communist government had us under, our house, and when we were living in Revolution Plaza, was bugged. And it was not a secret that it was bugged. Every month, the Ministry of the Interior would send my father a libretto, this thick, with every conversation that my parents had had during that month, including their intimacies. And my father would have to sign off on this libretto so that it would be archived in the intelligence library. So my parents knew that the house, every room in that house was bugged. So when we moved to Fontanar, my mother began to do something strange. And one night, she began to clean the entire house. But I noticed that in the sitting room, she took the curtains and she dipped them in water. I thought my mother has gone mad. But she was not going mad. She knew that in the seam of the curtain, there was a microphone. And she knew that the microphone, which was a Soviet microphone, was of such low quality that if you dipped it in water, it would begin to rust. And in a couple of days, it would cease functioning. And she would do this several days ahead of time so that she could have a private conversation in that room. And then when the Secret Service would arrive to see why the microphone was not working, they would ask my mother what happened here. My mother could say, "Oh, I don't know what this where these things are, and I was cleaning my house, and unfortunately, I cleaned my curtains, and now the microphone, is in that condition, stopped working, but it was not my fault." So one day I noticed my mother was doing one such a thing, and later in the evening, as I was studying in my room, I noticed this lady. My window was open, and I saw this lady at the gate of our garden, and she very discreetly sounded the bell. But there was something very strange about her. She was wearing absolutely no jewelry. She was wearing a skirt below her knee, very modestly dressed, but with a great deal of elegance and posture. And she was holding in her hand a plastic bag, like a plastic shopping bag. And that was a very telltale sign, because in Cuba, there were no plastic bags. The only people that had plastic bags were people that shopped at the diplomatic stores. And the only people that shopped at diplomatic stores were ambassadors and dignitaries of the government or foreigners. So when she was standing there with a plastic bag, I thought, who could this lady be? So I was not invited to meet her. My mother did not come to my room to go to the visit. And my mother was extremely strict in the way that she was raising me. Every day, a little note card was placed in front of my place in the table that said, "Children do not speak at table." So I was not allowed to speak at table. And I was not allowed to meet our visitors. I had to be presented. And the presentation consisted that I would come into the room, I would recite a poem by Jose Marti, and then I would leave the room, and I would not partake in any of the conversation between the adults, and I would return to my room. So I was very curious to find out who this lady was. And my mother was speaking to her in the sitting room, and I could not hear their conversation. So I hid in the hallway. There was a large tapestry that hung between the wall and that went all the way down to the floor. And I slipped through the back till I got to the near the sitting room so I could overhear the conversation. Mind you, if my mother found me doing this, let me tell you, she was a great believer of not sparing the rod. So I had to be very careful that I would not be found out. And as I got close to the sitting room, I saw something incredible. This lady had opened this plastic bag, and inside of the plastic bag was a shoebox that she had opened, and there was a pair of patent leather black shoes, high-heeled shoes. And there was a little box with a little watch and several letters. And when she opened this, my mother began to sobbed like a little girl. And they both stood up and they hugged and began to cry together. But the level of intimacy in this hug and in this sobbing was as if they were sisters, and they were comforting each other. And I didn't know who this woman was. And as I edged closer, I tipped over a vase that was standing on a column that broke, shattered. And then my mother and this lady turned to me, white as ghosts. And I thought, well, now I am going to get a spanking as soon as this lady leaves. And what happened next was the opposite. My mother, I was by that time 8 years old. She knelt down in front of me and began to plead my forgiveness because she was a traitor to the revolution. The fact that she was meeting with this lady was an act of treason, because there was a series of laws called the laws of this diversion and distortion of ideology that prohibited the members of the government from meeting privately with any person that was a representative of a religious body. And this act alone of her meeting her privately was an act of treason. And my mother knew that I had been taught since I was born that my first and primary duty was to the Communist Party and to the revolution. And it was my duty to the revolution to report my mother if she was in any way infringing upon the ideology or the laws of the revolution. So my mother was pleading me to keep this secret that she was meeting with Betsaida. And I was enthralled. I thought, finally, I can see why my mother is so different. And who is this lady? But the lady knew that she had a very small window, and that in that very small window, she had to do a lot. So she immediately sat me in her lap, and without asking permission from my mother or anything, she began immediately to talk to me about God. And she said, Alexis, as if I was her son, you belong to a family that has been serving God for decades. Let me tell you about your great-grandfather. And she began to tell me about my great-grandfather. And then let me tell you about your grandfather. And let me tell you about your aunts and uncles who are spread across the world and what they did for the Lord and what the Lord did for them. And I want to introduce you to a wonderful friend that I have, and his name is Jesus, Alexis. And Jesus has been looking over you since you were born. And she knew that this impact, though small, was her only opportunity to drop that little seed and have the faith that the Lord would germinate that seed. And so when this lady left, I had been introduced into this secret world of this resistance, of all these people that were part of this church that I knew nothing about. And I was enthralled. And now I could bond with my mother and understand the complexity of why she was so cold and aloof. It was because she was suffering through the grief of the loss of her faith, the loss of her family, the loss of a world that had disappeared like in Atlantis and in the middle of our Caribbean world. And Betsaida left, but she left that seed, that question. And my father returned from Romania, and my mother and I were going to keep this secret from my father. But my father was a member of the intelligence, and he had worked as a spy for quite some time. And he was an extremely observant man with a photographic mind. And he would sit back reading his newspapers in the morning. They would bring him the newspapers from around the world so that he would keep up with what was happening in each country. And to give an example, one morning he would, while reading his newspaper, he would say to my mother, Xiomara, 3 months ago, you visited so-and-so. who has questionable social backgrounds and has contacts with this and that person who are counter-revolutionaries. I knew the day that you visited that person. I'm just wondering how long it's going to take you to let me know that you visited that person. And 3 months had passed. So because of that, we had to be very conscious that our conduct, that our habits, that our gestures would not give us away, that I knew this secret that was forbidden for me to know. But God began to work in mysterious ways from that point forward. So several months after that, one evening, I went to take some classes with the historian of the city of Havana. And he was giving me classes of architecture along with another group of children. And my mother asked that our chauffeur not come and pick us up to take us back home. She wanted me to go back home in the buses with the people. My mother would rip open from time to time the curtains of this bubble glass world in which we live, so that I could see the real condition in which normal people lived in Cuba. And so she would take me to the tenements in Havana so that I would see the truth of communism and not this gilded cage in which we lived. And at that time, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Cuba fell into a horrendous economic depression. There was no fuel. And so everybody had to take the bus, except very few people that were still, members of the government, such as my father, etc. But the whole population would have to take the bus. And there would be one bus for hundreds of people. So people would literally attack the buses. So we took one of these buses that was replete with people, and the bus broke down in the neighborhood of Marianao in the city of Havana. And of course, everybody got angrily off the bus and blamed the chauffeur, and they wanted to lynch him. How dare this bus that was like 40 years old break down after they had waited 6 hours for the bus. And but something interesting happened. It was Friday evening, and I closed my eyes, I still see it. The bus broke down in a corner of a street. So we had to walk to another street to get another bus. But as we were walking, we passed in front of a church. And I had been studying colonial architecture, and many of the churches, there were several churches in Cuba that have been converted into museums of atheism. And so the guide would take you to show you these great monuments to infidelity and to superstition, and how we have been enlightened since because there is no God, and so on and so forth. But I had never seen a church in function as a church proper. So it was Friday evening as we were crossing in front of the church. The doors of the church were open, and the stained glass windows of the church were open, and you could hear people singing inside of the church. So I became very curious, and I went in front of the church, and I said, Mother, can we go inside of the church? And she looked at the sign that was on top of the front door that said Templo Adventista del Séptimo Día, Seventh-day Adventist Temple. And my mother began to sob. And I didn't understand why she was sobbing. I said, what's the matter? And she said, Alexis, this is the church that I left in my youth. And that decision has costed me the peace of my conscience ever since. And so she said, you really want to go into that church? I said, yes, I want to go. I think it's interesting. I want to hear them sing. She said, okay. They are members of that church that work for your father. They're infiltrated cells of the government that are within every church. It is their job to report everything that happens in that church and to report on every person and their activities. So if we go into that church, we will be breaking the laws of diversion of ideology. And the government will take you away from me until you are of age. They will send you to a re-education camp. And because I brought you to church, they will send me to the marble quarries of the Isle of Pines for a period of 15 to 20 years. So she said, if you want to go in that church, come with me. So she took me to the corner of the street. It had been raining earlier in the afternoon, and there was a little bit of mud. And she knelt down, took the mud, and splattered it on my face. And I thought, she's gone crazy. And I said, Mom, what are you doing? She said, Alexis, you are often on television with your father during this military parades. You're a recognizable face. If we go into that church, nobody can recognize us. We have to be unrecognizable. So after she splattered me with the mud and herself, so that we wouldn't be as recognizable, she went all the way with me to the very first pew so that nobody could turn around and look at us. So the only people that could see our face were the people that were taking part at the altar. So we sat there, and my mother cried through the entire service, which was the Vesper service to welcome the Sabbath. But unbelievably, who was the Bible worker at that church? None other than Betsaida Giraldo. So when she saw us walk in, she immediately recognized us. And then she came to the front and sat right next to us and held my mother's hand as she sobbed through the service. But she was not going to waste any time. So she approached two brothers who were my age, Obed and Joel. And their story is incredible as well, but because of time, I cannot share it. But these little boys had memorized entire books of the Bible, because since the Bible was forbidden, it became the job of many of the children in the church to become the secret scribes of the Holy Word, to be saved for the next generation. So there was very few copies of the Bible. There was very few copies of the works of Ellen G. White, and these works were treasured in secret. And it was the job of the children in the church not only to memorize huge fragments of these works, so that if those works were destroyed, they could be salvaged to memory. It was also their job to transcribe them, so that if the originals were lost, these works could be will still be regained. So these boys had written by their own hands, and these were 8-year-olds, many of the works of Ellen G. White. And Obed in particular knew by memory the entire Psalms and several of the New Testament books, 8 years old. It was a part of the Vesper service for children to come up to recite as much as they could remember of the New Testament and the Old Testament. And those brothers in particular were incredible. Their memory was incredible. And Obed and Joel had written down all of the New Testament. And when they came and sat next to me after church was done, they began to converse with me. And they said, we have something very special for you. It is a treasured book. And we are going to entrust this, which is our greatest treasure, to you. as an honor to you, but you have to return it. So they gave me this thick folio of papers, which was the handwritten and typed New Testament. And they said, you have to bring it next Sabbath. So next Sabbath, you have to come and see us. But you have to read all of it this week, because we have somebody very special that we need to give it to that person next week. So I went home with all these papers. And with the last Soviet batteries that I had on my flashlight, I slept under my bed for a week reading the New Testament. And then, of course, we would have to go back to that church to give it back to Obed and Joel. The story of how we had to go back to that church, because in order to do that, you had to fool the intelligence and the counterintelligence and the official who was in charge of following you. So then you would have to go through all these different steps to lose them, to get to church, to be disguised, to give back the New Testament to Obed and Joel. But this was a way of getting us back to church. So that Sabbath, when we went back to church, I returned the New Testament, and Obed and Joel said, well, we have something very, very, very special. And my brother and I, we have been working on this for months. And we are going to give you the opportunity to read the Psalms. But you have to bring it back next Sabbath, because we have somebody very special that we have to give it to them afterwards. So I went back home. I read the Psalms. I came the next Sabbath. And then the next Sabbath, they said, well, how did you like it? It was enthralling. It was something secretive. It was forbidden. I felt like I was, some sort of spy like my father. I said, well, we have something very special. Very, 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 very special. It's the book of Exodus. But you can't tell anybody that you're reading the book of Exodus. We're going to give you the book of Exodus, but you have to bring it back next Sabbath, because we have to give it to somebody else who's very special. So I read the book of Exodus. And piecemeal by piecemeal, enthralled and excited about this secret world that I was beginning to explore, I read the Bible. And after I read the Bible, I began to read The Desire of Ages, chapter by chapter, handwritten by 8-year-olds. But you had to bring it back next Sabbath, because somebody very special needed to read it also. After that, we began to go to Bible studies. But these were secret Bible studies. And you began to take these Bible studies, but you also began to prepare for torture. Because since these were secret Bible studies, if you were caught, you had to prepare to be tortured and not to give out the names of all the other people that were partaking in these Bible studies. All of this was before the opening and relaxation of the laws of distortion of ideology and diversion of ideology. And so I was in the midst of this incredible world of all these secrets and all this, cloak and dagger kind of situations where, you were reading these amazing books that were forbidden and returning them. And so as this was happening, the Lord began to speak to my heart. And my mother, of course, had become my partner in crime. And throughout this, Betsaida Giraldo, the Bible worker, had not wasted a moment. Not a moment wasted. And would speak to me about this loving, patient Lord that was constantly interceding on our behalf. And this God was the God of these amazing kids and of these amazing people. These people that were so peculiar, so different, so out of the ordinary, so loving, and of this community. And one night I decided that I wanted to be part of that community. So as we had left church, it was a Friday night, and we were in the bus stop, because all of this, we were taking different buses so that our chauffeur would never know where we were going. And I sat in the bus stop and I said to my mother, Mom, I want to be baptized. My mother looked at me and she said, you want to be what? I said, yes, I want to be baptized. And tomorrow I'm going to tell my father that I am visiting the church and that I want to become a Seventh-day Adventist. And my mother said, do you realize what that means? Let me tell you what that means. Number one, your father is going to divorce me. Number two, you're going to be sent to a re-education camp, because both your father and I are going to lose custody over you. Number three, I'm going to be sent off to a labor camp for 15 to 20 years. Number four, you're not going to remember who you are when they're done with you at that re-education camp. But the peculiar thing was that that week before, Joel and Obed had given me a book, the book of Esther. And on that book, I was a young woman that had been faced with a choice. And she said, if I perish, I perish. And so I said to my mom, Mom, the Lord doesn't want me to lie to my father. The Lord wants me to tell my father the truth. And if I perish, I perish. And so that night, my mother and I, we prepared for the next day, where I was going to take this step of faith. And that night, my father and my mom came to my room, and they told me, Alexis, tomorrow morning, we're not going to be home, because my father had to go and receive the Prime Minister of Nigeria at the airport. And my mother had to attend a trial, which is another miraculous story, but because of the time, I cannot go into. They were asking for my mother for 40 years of privation of liberty, because there was $20,000 missing at her job. My mother was the only person that went to that trial without a lawyer. And when she presented, the judge asked her, ma'am, where's your lawyer? And she said, my lawyer is invisible. And she was the only person that walked free out of that courtroom that day. And that's just to give you a snippet of that invisible lawyer that was taking care of her. So I was going to be left home alone until my parents would get home around noon. So I woke up the next morning, and I wanted to make breakfast, but I had never made breakfast before. So I went into the kitchen, and I went to the furnace room and removed a container of fuel. And the government had taken all the gas kitchens away because there was they were needed, the gas tanks away from the houses that had gas, and they had replaced them with this kerosene kitchens. And I had seen my mom light this device several times, so I thought I could do the same. So I took the fuel and I poured it on the device, and I lit it on fire. But in Cuba at the time, there was nothing of anything, to the point where if you lit a match, you would put out that match and save the fragment of the match, so that you wouldn't use two matches to light the different places on the kitchen. So you would light it with one and use the fragment of the other match to light the other, because there was not even matches in Cuba at the time. So trying to save that match fragmentation, I lit the match and threw it on the ground without noticing that it had gone inside of this small opening of that fuel tank that was half full. And as I did that, I knelt down and closed the fuel tank without realizing that that warm match had gone inside of that fuel container. So I pulled this fuel container under my arm, and I began to walk it back to the furnace room. And as I was crossing the dining room, which was a hermetically closed room in the house, all of a sudden, I heard this huge blast. And the wall next to me began to crack down. And what did I think it was? I thought, oh, the Yankees are invading. Because since you're born, you're told that the Yankees are going to invade one day, and you're being prepared for this invasion of the Yankees, and they're going to bombard everything. And so I thought, well, the Yankees must be bombarding the house. This is the long-awaited invasion of the Yankees. And so thinking about that, I began to kneel down next to the wall. But then I began to feel like as if I had a hurricane in my hair. And at the time, I had this long, straight hair that I miss very much now. And I lifted up my arms to touch my head to see what it was that I was feeling. And when I lifted up my arms, I noticed that I was missing my right arm. That container of fuel that I was holding became a bomb. When it blasted, it was felt for a kilometer radius around our house. It created a rare chemical reaction within the room that I was in. Because it was hermetically closed, the wave of expansion had nowhere to go. So it cooked me from inside out like a pressure cooker. The blast went up, taking off my arm and leaving my right arm hanging from the tendons of my back. And then the industrial plastic, the thick industrial plastic of the container was going from one side of my body to the other. When the wave of expansion finally ripped off the windows with their window frames, they landed several meters away from our house. That's to give you an idea of the violence of that blast. And yet, in the midst of me being consumed by the fire, I realized something. This was not an accident. At this interval, when my mother and I were willing to sacrifice our lives for our faith, this happened. How odd. And as I was being burnt, I began to pray, because I knew that my mother's hard heart had been softened by the Lord. And I began to pray, Father, if I die, please provide that my mother will continue to walk in the path that we have chosen. But if I live, Lord, I only want to live to worship and glorify you. And as I was praying, this complete quiet came over the room. And when I opened my eyes, I was no longer kneeling in the pool of blood that I had been on. I was standing in front of the open door of the bathroom of my house. When I looked at the floor-length mirror that was in front of the door, that shadow that I was seeing in front of my eyes and all that tumult that I was feeling in my head was the flames that were licking my body over and over as a human torch that I had become. because I had been wearing a polyester shirt, which when it lit, it made me into a human torch. And so when I saw that, I looked at the water faucet, and I thought, well, I thought I had fainted. I lost consciousness, and somebody has brought me here. Because when I saw the water faucets, they were both turned on. The water was running in the water faucet. So I began to scream for help. Because 75% of my body was being burnt to the 3rd degree, my nervous system had shut down entirely, and I was feeling no pain whatsoever. So this allowed me to think logically. And I thought, well, somebody heard the blast, has come into the house, and has brought me here and has turned on the water. And I began to scream for help. There was no one in the house. And so I remember the story that my father told me about a friend of his that had lost a finger. And I took a towel after I splashed myself and put the flames off. I took a towel, and with my teeth and my left hand, I wrapped the towel around my neck and I lost my shoulder, but secure what was left of my arm to what was left of the shoulder socket with the towel, and I tied it with my teeth. So to keep that secure around my neck to my body so that I wouldn't lose as much blood. And I went outside to find help. And yet the Lord, incredibly, because his plans are perfect. Next to our house lived our worst enemy. And the Lord chose that man to save me. He was taking a nap, and in the middle of his nap, he heard a voice in his sleep that said, "Get up and help your neighbor now." And when that happened, he woke up, heard the blast, saw the smoke coming out of the dining room. And you know what that man said? "Oh, somebody else will help. Somebody else will find him." And then he went back to bed. When he went back to his bedroom, that voice that was in his sleep was audible in his room and said to him again, "Go to your neighbor now." And that man that was in his underwear jumped out of the 2nd-story balcony of his house into our garden and ran full onto me and hugged me. And when he hugged me, he started screaming because my body temperature was so elevated that when he hugged me, his chest melted into my chest, and then we could not be separated. So he was burning with me, and he began to scream in anguish for help. So a neighbor came, got us into a car, and took us to the William Soler hospital. And when we got to the hospital, the elevator was broken. So this man recited the revised dictionary of vulgar words from the 1st floor to the last floor of that hospital, where all the doctors were waiting for us because, this hurricane was coming up the stairs. And then they took us to the OR, where they surgically removed him and I from each other. He suffered a 3rd-degree burns in all of his chest and torso. And I was taken into intensive care. I have already reached my maximum time. I have to give you in the next 10 minutes how the Lord took me from the valley of the shadow of death to the land of freedom in the USA, which is an impossible task, but I will try to do this. When I ended up in the ICU, the doctors gave my parents that I would live another 5 days at most. because the temperature that my body had reached was so high, my internal organs were boiling in their own fluids. And there was absolutely no way of saving me. And something incredible happened. This news that I was dying spread like wildfire throughout the city of Havana. And to each church, Seventh-day Adventist church. And the people of God lost their fear. And guess what they did? All the members of the Seventh-day Adventist churches gathered in front of the hospital to pray and fast day and night. This was the first religious demonstration in Cuba since the triumph of the revolution. And it became a political scandal. And so every 15 minutes, a nurse would go out into all these brethren to tell them, he's still alive, this is what his vitals are, this is what he's doing. And all those people stayed in that park for weeks, taking turns. 5 or 10 brothers from the Church of Mariana would come in the morning and would be replaced by 5 or 10 brothers at night. From every church and every district of the city, fasting and prayer, fasting and prayer, fasting and prayer. And I would live another day, and another day, and another day, and another day, and another day. After 3 months, they stopped gathering in the public park in front of the hospital. And then the national church prayed and fasted over me every week of every month for the next 2.5 years. The power of fasting and prayer. You're seeing it right here in front of you, because I should never be alive. And so this community gathered and galvanized and with us, irregardless of personal risk, irregardless of consequence, irregardless of danger. And all of a sudden, all these pastors were standing in the same hallways with their persecutors, all these generals and colonels that were in charge of sending them to the concentration camps. It came to such a pivot that Raul Castro would come and see me every Friday. And one night, he came quietly and sat next to my bed and began to read my medical history. And he said to me that night, as I was intubated, Alexis, I don't believe in my shadow because it moves too much. But the only thing that your case has demonstrated is that there has to be a God. And that was a man who had persecuted and tried to exterminate the presence of God in Cuba. And so it became, every day was a miracle closer into a new day, a miracle closer into a next week, a miracle closer into a next month. I could sit here for hours to enumerate the incredible miracles that God had to do to show a communist country that indeed he was there, alive and working. And that God that opened the Red Sea, that God that made modern rain was there with them, knocking at their heart. I am your Savior. I have not been exiled. I have not been exterminated. I am a loving God. I have restitution. I have salvation. And so in the next months, I began to survive one day, and then another, and then another. And a year after I was sent to go home for 3 days every week. And after a couple of weeks of this, I began to experience a complication with my airways. All the keloids that had developed outside of my body were developing inside of my body as well. And they were webbing and closing up my airways. So when they did the tests and they came back, they told my parents, there is no cure for this. He is going to die. In Cuba, we don't have the technology to be able to do the operation that he needs. Only one country at that time had done the operation that I needed, which was a complete reconstruction of the airways. And at that time, it had been done in West Germany successfully. So my mother began to do everything possible to take me to West Germany. But now it had become a public knowledge that we have been going to church. But my mother, during this whole thing, had really pretty much lost her fear. And she had gone to the government and said, Alexis got burnt because of the system. Because you people took away our gas kitchens and gave us these kerosene kitchens that explode. And like Alexis, there's thousands of children dying in Cuba now because these kitchens explode. So this is a problem with the system. And because my parents were who they were, they had an international audience and international attention. So they could not be easily squashed or silenced. So she became a big problem for the communist government. My mother began to write letters to all the foreign dignitaries. Please help us to take Alexis to West Germany. But this was, of course, an impossibility. So Castro himself said that Cuba could not give itself the luxury of sending me to West Germany. So the next country that did the surgery successfully was England at the Imperial College in London. So my mother wrote a letter to the Countess of Barcelona, who was the mother of the King of Spain at the time. And they needed a doctor that would say that Cuba did not have the technology to do this operation, but no doctor in Cuba would say that because Cuba was undergoing an international campaign demonstrating to the world that we were a medical powerhouse. We have brought the children of Chernobyl to Cuba to treat them because Cuban medicine was so far advanced, far more advanced than the medicine in the West, that we were the pioneers of everything. And how could the pioneers of everything in such an advanced medical system not have the ability to treat the son of one of his highest standing and highest ranking dignitaries? So the communist government wanted me to die in Cuba rather than for the scandal of the truth of what was happening in Cuba to come out on top of the religious persecution. So during our stay at the hospital, the famous 1991 Congress of the Communist Party occurred, and an investigation was conducted about the families of all this elite cupula of the government. And guess what that investigation found? That a great majority of the sons and daughters of all those colonels and generals and ambassadors were visiting the church in secret. And so you're telling me that we're going to have to put in concentration camps the flower and creme de la creme of the next generation of our leadership? So they had to relax the laws of diversion and distortion of ideology. So by the time that I got out of the hospital, it was no longer a crime to visit the church. God works in mysterious ways. During those weeks that I was home for those days, I decided that I wanted to become baptized. But of course, this was an impossibility. And then I got very ill again and had to return to the hospital, to the intensive care of the cardiovascular ward, where I spent a year with the children of Chernobyl. I don't want, because of the time, to dwell into the children of Chernobyl. It's a very difficult chapter of my testimony. I was with the children of Chernobyl in that ward and witnessed the death of 90% of those children who were being used as guinea pigs for the glorification of Cuban medicine. But if I have written about this experience, I have some of those writings in my Facebook page if some of you want to read about them, or my testimony is in some parts of YouTube where I talk about the children of Chernobyl and that part of my testimony. So during that time that I was there, the King of Spain sent a physician who was his personal otolaryngologist. And this physician convened a panel and was the physician that wrote that Cuba did not have the technology to conduct my operation, and that my only saving grace would be to travel to England or West Germany. He wrote, furthermore, that my percentage of life without that surgery was 0.000,1, which is the size of the eye of a worm. Because of that gentleman, my mother began to try to take me to England. The Countess of Barcelona and the Spanish royal family contacted the British royal family so that through them we could travel to Britain and receive the treatment there and stay at a special housing that they would provide, and then be sent back to Cuba as a humanitarian gesture. After all of this strenuous paperwork was done, the Cuban government, and it was received at Cuba's immigration from the British embassy. What did you think that the Cuban immigration office did with this paperwork? They wrote back to the British liaison that Cuba was not interested in the interests of the monarchy in Britain. And they stepped on the papers and sent back the papers peed on and stepped on to the British embassy, which closed the doors for us to be able to travel to Britain. And the doors have been closed already for us to travel to West Germany. And so my mother went absolutely mad. I had a period of perhaps a year before I would die if I didn't receive this surgery. So she contacted her family in the United States and asked them to knock on every door, on every window, everywhere, to see if a physician in the United States would do this operation. The fact of bringing me to the United States after we had not been allowed in Germany or Britain was pure lunacy, because the United States was our arch enemy. So this was absolute madness. But my mother went ahead nonetheless and started doing all the paperwork and everything. And every time she would introduce this to the government would send it back with some bureaucratic detail or some comma or some paragraph that had not been fulfilled. Meanwhile, my mother's family went to every single children's hospital here in the United States to try to find an otolaryngologist that would do this operation, which would be the first operation of its kind here in the United States. And they found just such a doctor in Boston's Children's Hospital, which is the best children's hospital in the United States. There was a doctor there, her name is Laurie H. Holmes, who had just begun her career. And Laurie H. Holmes took a look at my medical records, took a look at my story, and she decided to do something incredible for a person that she had never met. She decided that she was going to put her career on hold, that she was going to travel to England to study with the same team that had undergone this surgery at the Imperial College. And she went and studied with them for several months, and then came back to the United States and donated from her own personal fortune $2.5 million so that she would be able to pay the rest of the team to do this surgery, which was going to be a surgery that was going to be above 12 hours long. So we got that part done, but then how to take me out of Cuba? We have all of that, and as soon as we have all of that, Cuba, of course, immediately denied our entry into the United States. But now faith is the substance of things hoped for. And what a hope. What an impossible hope. Of things not seen. Through faith, we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that things which are seen were not made of things which do appear. One day, my parents were arguing about this, and I interrupted their argument. I said to my father, "Dad, why are we arguing about this? If God wants me to go to the United States, I will go to the United States. And if God doesn't want me to go to the United States, I will not go to the United States. It's not in your hands. It's not in my hands. It's in His will." And so my mother was named Madame Fatigue because she would wake up 4 o'clock in the morning to do paperwork, to go see every minister in Cuba, to go see every government official, to get this signature, to get that signature. Every document was a miraculous achievement. Until at last, she got the permission to come to the United States. And then a week later, it was denied again. And this happened 5 times. And I was dying in the interval. So one day, and I remember it, and I'm skipping over a lot of events. One morning, by this time, they had done a tracheostomy. And I want to pause here for a moment because I need you to hear this story, because this is important. God, the God that opened the Red Sea is here. And He is here now. And I don't know what Red Sea you have in your life, but He can open that Red Sea. I had to have a surgery to prolong the time of life that I had before that other surgery. And because I had so much webbing in my airways, the doctors didn't know where they were going to open me up to remove the greatest web. So they were guessing. After the burn, my arm had webbed with a scar from here to here, and from my neck here. So I was like this. And I had in the beginning of my treatments, I had 40 operations without anesthesia. They had done those operations in between the operations that had used anesthesia, because the anesthetics that they were using were old Soviet anesthetics that accumulate in your body. And after all that accumulation, they can cause a heart attack. So I had gone through 40 operations in cold blood. That is another story altogether of how I survived that. But because I was webbed like that, the doctors that were treating me would not tie me up on the stretcher for surgery as they do people, because sometimes people do gestures during surgery, during the anesthetics. So when the physician went to cut in my neck, and I'm sorry, I'm going to, I don't know if I can show you guys. I had a trach for 13 years, but I don't know if you see this scar here that goes across my neck and then down across here again. That scar was caused during that surgery when the doctor was guessing. And I'm going to take off for a moment so I can show you this. You see here on my arm, there is a gap right there where my elbow closes, and that has a scar that goes across it also. And I have a skin graft right here. This from here to here was webbed closed, shut tight. And what you see, the rest of my arm has been completely reconstructed with skin grafts from my legs, that they took all the skin of my legs off. So when I was in the operating room, my arm was constricted as such. And the church had been praying and fasting, praying and fasting, praying and fasting. And that morning, Betsaida, the Bible worker, her husband, all the church family had gathered in the hospital, and they were praying and fasting constantly. And when I was taken into the OR, I can't tell the whole story because of time, but when the doctor took his scalpel to begin to cut here, which was really the wrong place, where inside I had the major obstructions. I was under anesthetic for that operation. I extended my arm and I ripped all that webbing off with that extension, and that exposed an artery. And this artery began to splash blood up in the air. The nurse that was attending the physician to give him the instruments was blinded momentarily by the blood that splashed in her eye, and she began to faint. So she held to the stretcher and to the arm of the physician who was cutting, and this is why he cuts across here and then down, because of that jerk movement that he has to do as he's doing the incision. And when he cuts down, he opens up my trachea in the exact spot where the major obstructions were. Then the surgery got more complicated because they had to do a skin graft to cover this area and stop the artery from hemorrhaging. From that point forward, I was mute for about a month. I regained after a month my voice. And to this day, the scientific community doesn't know how I speak because I am missing part of my vocal cords, which happened during that whole surgery to remove as many as those obstructions as possible so that I could survive for a year longer before, if it was possible, to come to the United States. Finally, after 5 denials, the Cuban government gave us the permission to come to the United States. They were going to send me originally with a member of the intelligence that was going to accompany me to the hospital and then was going to take me back to Cuba. But my mother, by a series of intrigues, was able to convince the government that we were not going to desert. And so it is that we were allowed to come to the United States. This became a huge media event here in the United States because I was the first son of a dignitary of the Cuban government that came legally to the United States under those auspices. My mother and I deserted from the Cuban government. 2 weeks after our arrival in the United States, we did our defection on national television here in the United States. I was invited to speak at the United Nations about the abuses of the religious community in Cuba, and the Cuban government unleashed a terror campaign where I was, and so we were not able to attend that session. Laurie H. Ohms went on to do this life-saving surgery. It was expected that the surgery was going to take 12 to 16 hours, and I emerged from the surgery 5 hours later because many of the webbings had healed on their own. And I don't believe that they had healed on their own. It was the fasting and prayer of all those countless people of that community of faith, and of a God that touched the heart of many of the doctors and nurses who then went on to convert to Adventism in Cuba. It's an incredible story, a story of a God of love that brought the daughter of a beloved son back into his fold by using this horrible tragedy to touch many people. I was able to then go on to assist, to attend Adventist education here in the United States, just like my mother had in Cuba before the time of the revolution, and to be able to live that miracle which has been denied to the Cuban youth, that Cuban youth that has salvaged the Gospels, that has shared the Gospels. And once the religious question was open in Cuba, I was able to witness before we left how the churches became completely full, where the members had to stand outside of it because the population was so hungry, so thirsty to hear of God, to hear and feel that Lord that is ever present in our lives. I want to share with you as I close the words of Isaiah 40. And all of us have quagmires. All of us have valleys of the shadow of death, like I experienced, in different levels and magnitudes. And it says here on Isaiah 40, verse 29, it says, "He giveth power to the faint, and to them that have no might, he increaseth strength. Even the youth shall faint and be weary, and the young men shall utterly fall. But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary, and they shall walk and not be faint." Thank you for this opportunity to share my story. It is my prayer and hope that you can experience in your life this same miraculous God that I have experienced. I want to show before we close a couple of pictures. This is Betsaida Giraldo and her husband, Victor. And she is today, she came to exile 10 years after we left Cuba. She is today the Bible worker of the Miami SDA Central Church. And she is still going strong, saving souls and working for the Lord with her husband. This is my grandfather, who is the first member of the family who became an Adventist and with whom I began the story. When when we left Cuba, we're not allowed to take any photographs with us. This is a picture that came later. I was salvaged by some friends of my mother on her wedding day. This is a picture of me 2 weeks before my fateful accident. And the story I told you about my Aunt Cholene, whose lands had been confiscated, who was very instrumental in the spreading of the church, founded hospitals and schools, Adventist schools in Cuba, and who has died now 7 years past here in exile. This is the only picture that we were allowed to take out of Cuba, and it's a picture of my father. This is my brother, Adelmar. We spent 17 years without seeing him. This was the first picture of him after we were reunited here in exile. And this is a picture of my son, Grayson, and my mother in Cuba at the time of the Republic, before the revolution. And she is sitting here. She's been listening to me, and she wants to send a greeting to all our lovely brothers and sisters in Australia. Saluda, Mom.
Hi, how are you?
Her English is not as good as that. Feliz sábado.
Feliz sábado.
And we want to thank you for allowing us to come into your home, share our story, and we want you to see that our Lord of Miracles is sacrificing and is interceding on our behalf, and that the Lord has a plan of rescue and a plan of salvation. Thank you, and I pass it over to the pastor.
Bendiciones.
Thank you so much, Alexis. I have no words. Thank you so much for sharing your story. As you said, more information or more people can understand from your Facebook, is it? Are you able to just help us to know where to go for the Facebook?
Correct. Yeah, I can. The stories are written on my Facebook, on the story part. So, and on YouTube, there are several. If you type in my name, there are several channels that have aired the more complete story of the testimony of the miracles that the Lord has done.
Wow, thank you so much for being faithful at such a tough time, and what a message to our young people who have never experienced such things here in Australia. Thank you so much. We will finish now with prayer. Thank you so much to everybody who has been involved today to help to bring this testimony to us, particularly Ray. Thank you, Ray, for asking Alexis to come and share this message with us. Thank you so much. Let's pray. Holy God, my words are escaping me at the moment because of these events, but through everything we understand that you are watching us, that you care for us, and that when we call, you are present there for us, Lord God. Teach us, Lord. May we be your students. May we not make a conclusion about you, but may we sit and listen. May we understand who you are because of the things that you've told us. Help us to know you in a true and personal way. Help us to walk with you and give us faith like this testimony has focused upon. Give us faith to trust you in everything. We pray in Jesus' wonderful name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you so much.
Happy